Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. It's nice to be here with you, and of course we need to thank Kiernan Milling and Alltech for sponsoring these workshops. Sean has said I'm going to do the first half of the meeting and Stephen will do the second half of the meeting. And as Sean has already said, in January we talked about the guilt and dry sow. Last month we talked about the sow during lactation. Today we're going to talk about the weaned piglet. Next month we'll talk about the grower and finishing animal, and then there'll be further workshops in relation to ventilation and then health and safety. Weaning. Weaning is perhaps the most critical and stressful period in the life of a pig. It is at its most sensitive and is very easily overcome by many factors that influence performance. It is very susceptible to infection and disease, and all of these things result in reduced performance through to slaughter. So weaning is a very critical phase in the life and development of the modern pig. And this is this little animal we want to discuss today. What are the keys to successful weaning? We've already talked about some of these when we had the previous workshops. A very important one is that that little piglet has the correct weight for the age at which it is weaned. We need our animals to be as healthy as possible and to have a high level of immunity. Obviously, feeding and watering is very important. And one of the problems we have in the piglet after weaning is how do we get it to eat enough to match its genetic potential. We'll talk a little bit about gut function and health, because what happens at weaning has a very big impact on gut function and development, and that of course influences digestion and absorption of nutrients and hence growth and performance. Environment is very, very important. The pen needs to be clean, dry and comfortable. Each piglet must have a quiet place to relax. And then finally, we need to minimize aggression. There will be some aggression, but by the facilities we have, hopefully, we can minimize aggression on those animals. This goes back to the previous workshop, and what is very, very important is the weight at which we wean those piglets. Because the higher the weaning weight, the higher the level of productivity. That means the potential for lean gain is much greater. That animal grows faster. It reaches slaughter weight faster, which means less feed is requirement, less time, and all of that means a higher return. So weaning weight is really the starting point at getting good performance post-weaning. And if you recall, we discussed this in the previous two workshops. What is important is birth weight, because birth weight has a big impact on weaning weight, and weaning weight has a big impact on performance after weaning, and that performance or better performance lasts right through to slaughter. So all of these different areas are interrelated. And this is some very nice data which shows the effect of weaning weight on growth rate. And you can see in this slide, as weaning weight increases, growth rate increases. And of course, the amount of feed that those animals need, because they're on farm, in this instance, about 16 days less. That means 16 days less maintenance feed, which effectively means less feed. So the higher the weaning weight, the greater the performance after weaning, the greater the subsequent performance, less feed, more feed efficiency, and a higher return. And again, we saw this slide at the last meeting, some work from BPEX in the United Kingdom, just showing that as we increase weaning weight, the time taken to reach 100 kilos is dramatically reduced. And on average, for every 0.1 kilogram improvement in weaning weight, those pigs take 1 day less to slaughter. So think how much feed you're saving by getting those pigs to slaughter 1 day earlier. So weaning weight is very, very important. We have a problem, and that problem is after weaning, our piglets lose weight. But like any good organization, we must establish targets for our piglets. And my targets would be to achieve at least a 30 kilogram of body weight at 70 days of age. And that means we want a growth rate of at least 460 grams, feed efficiency around 1.35 to 1, and a mortality less than 2%. So if you are taking animals to 70 kilograms, 70 days of age, the minimum weight should be 30 kilograms, because the animals have the potential to grow. But here's our problem. This is diagrammatic, but it's to emphasize what the problem is. There's the age of the animal, there's its potential. So the first period here is lactation, and really the piglets grow quite fast. They don't quite meet their potential, but they're very close to it. But what happens at weaning has a very big impact on the performance of those animals afterwards. And every time we make a change, we reduce the potential of that animal. So it's in our interest to try and minimize the challenge on those animals, to try and reduce that lag of growth, that gap of growth which occurs after weaning, because if we can do that, then we're going to make sure our animals are achieving as best they can their genetic potential throughout their life. This is just an example of post-weaning performance. Here are piglets weaned at 12 to 17 days, and here's change from weaning. This is growth. Here's the 0 line. That means that is the weaning weight of those animals. When we wean those animals at around 17 days, they lose weight, and it takes them 7 days to actually establish the weight at weaning. If we're weaning at around 28 days, again those little piglets lose weight, and it takes 3 to 4 days purely to establish the weight at weaning. And that there is lost productivity, that is lost potential, because the longer the time those little piglets take, it affects the whole metabolism and physiology of those animals, and that affects their performance. So the big question is, what causes this gap in the growth of those animals? And this is going to be the first part of my presentation. One is, those little piglets cannot secrete sufficient enzymes after a change in diet to make nutrients available for growth. We also see the capacity of the gut, the little villi, which are the appendages on the surface of the gut which absorb nutrients. They actually have a very reduced absorptive capacity, so those little piglets cannot absorb sufficient nutrients to fuel growth. We'll talk about gastric acid secretion. We all have acids in our stomach, and we need to maintain a low pH, because that then means best health, best performance. Removal of milk. Milk contains many beneficial factors that when we actually remove that milk from those little piglets, they don't get. So the composition of the diet after weaning is very, very important. We know there's going to be low feed intake. We change the form of the diet from all milk to all solid. There's environmental changes that causes stress on those animals, disease challenges, and reduced health. So those are all the changes that are occurring in the body of that little piglet at weaning. So weaning is a very big challenge. So we have our target of at least 460 grams, but in that first week, I want a growth rate of at least 250 grams per day. And those little piglets after weaning should be converting at 1-to-1. 250 grams of food, 250 grams of growth. And the reason for saying that is very, very important. Because if you look at the composition of the growth, growth contains protein, fat, and water. And those protein and water together are lean. So of those three things, protein, fat, and water. So here we have zero gain in those little piglets after weaning. But look what is happening. That little piglet is not gaining any protein, but it's gaining 50 grams of water in its body. It's not gaining any protein, is gaining 50 grams of water, that means it's losing 50 grams of fat from its body. And that has a big impact on its metabolism, on its physiology, biochemistry, and so on. In fact, we need to achieve a growth rate of over 200 grams per day just for those little piglets to actually maintain the similar level of lipid or fat in their body as they had at weaning. Fat also is very important for thermal insulation. So if those little piglets lose fat, they have less thermal insulation, we need to provide a higher temperature for them. So all of these things are related, and that's why we say we want a growth rate of 250 grams per day in that first week after weaning. That's why it is very, very important. Because here, if we don't have it, we are changing the body composition of those little piglets. If we get our animals to grow faster after weaning, and again, this is just another example showing growth rate in the first week after weaning, time taken to slaughter. These little piglets grow at less than 5 grams per day. They take 185 days. If we can improve growth rate, you see it has a dramatic effect on the time taken to achieve slaughter weight. And on average, for every 5 to 10 grams extra growth after weaning, those piglets will go to slaughter 1 day early. So it's not only weaning weight that's important, it's growth rate after weaning. They have a very, very big impact on growth rate through the slaughter and, of course, feed usage. So those two things are very, very important. So let's look at the changes that are occurring in the body of those little piglets, because that can maybe give us some idea the kind of things that we can do to help that piglet to try and reduce that growth gap after weaning. So here are some of the things we want to look at. We need to reduce stress. We need to improve the digestive competence within the gut. We need to improve the whole health of the gut, its immune status. We need to find ways to increase feed intake in those little piglets after weaning. We need to look at the diet. Are there any limiting factors in the diet that could be actually are not beneficial to that little piglet? Environment, management, and husbandry. These are all the things that we need to try and understand if we are to get better performance in our piglets after weaning. The first big problem we have is appetite. And this is some very, very nice work from the INRA Research Institute in France, where they looked at the energy intake of little piglets every day before and after weaning. So these two values here are the energy intake of those little piglets while suckling the sow. And you see nice high values. But after weaning, look what happens. Energy intake or feed intake falls dramatically. In fact, it takes 7 to 10 days after weaning until those little piglets achieve the same energy intake as they had from milk while suckling the sow. And that's part of the problem. Getting those little piglets to eat after weaning is critical. So, and that causes the growth lag. That's why we have that difference between what the potential is and what is actually happening on the farm. Maybe there's a reason for that. Let's just look at the composition of sow's milk and the composition of a typical creep or pre-starter diet. So there's the composition of sow's milk, there's the composition of starter diet. Well, the first thing is, one is liquid, the other is solid. If you look at crude protein content, starter diet contains 4 times more protein compared to sow's milk. If we look at lipid, it's about the same. Lactose would generally be higher in a starter diet than sow's milk. Energy is 2.5 times higher. And amino acids in the form of lysine is 4 times higher. So we're actually giving that little piglet a feed of totally different composition to what it was used to before. And the secret is trying to marry those two together. But it's not only the overall composition. One of the major nutrients in feed is energy. That energy can come from carbohydrate, it can come from lipid, or it can come from protein. That is the contribution that the different components of energy make from sow's milk. So in terms of carbohydrate, 14% of the energy is from carbohydrate. In creep feed, it's over 50%. In terms of lipid, it's 65% of the energy from sow's milk, but only 20% in the pre-starter diet or creep feed. And then protein is the same. So even though we say energy, the form of energy is very different, and that has a very big impact on the enzymes that are needed by that little piglet to digest the feed. And here's our dilemma. These are the enzymes that are needed to actually utilize milk, in particular lactase. Milk is high in lactose, so that little piglet needs the enzyme lactase to actually utilize that. The other enzymes, not as high as for lactase. But what happens? These are the enzymes that that little piglet needs to digest a typical pre-starter or creep diet. And the problem is it doesn't happen overnight. Those little piglets take time, that once we change the diet, it takes time to develop sufficient enzymes to utilize the nutrients, the substrates in the diet. And one of the keys is putting enzymes in the diet to try and help that transition period from the little piglet going from milk to creep diet or pre-starter diet. And we normally put enzymes in diet because that really helps that little piglet. The problem is, if that little piglet cannot digest those nutrients, what happens? They're not digested. Where do they go? Into the large intestine. What happens in the large intestine? This is where you get all the pathogenic bacteria. So you get all this undigested food passing into the large intestine. You've got your salmonella, your coliform. They think it's party time. So what happens? You get scarring and diarrhea. So it is very, very important that we actually have enzymes in diets to try and help that little piglet. The other thing we see is we see big changes in the structure of the gut. When that little piglet is suckling the sow, this is the surface of the small intestine. And the small intestine is aligned with a series of finger-like structures called villi. And it is the villi that actually absorb the nutrients from the food. And the longer the villi, the thinner the villi, the better the absorption. So here you see, when those little piglets are drinking milk, these nice, long, thin, slender-like villi. What happens when we wean that little piglet and we wean it onto dry feed? That's what we get. Instead of these nice, long, thin finger-like villi, they become very reduced, very tongue-like, and in fact, they become thicker. And once the cell wall becomes thicker, that means nutrients are not as easily absorbed. So what we're doing is, after weaning, we are reducing the nutrient absorptive capacity from the villi. This research work shows there's the villus height before weaning, very high, but look what happens after weaning. It becomes dramatically reduced. In fact, it probably takes anywhere 10 to 15 days to recover the length of those villi previously to what it was while suckling the sow. The other thing that is very important is underneath the villi, there's a kind of a base. And that base is called the crypt. So what we want is we want long, thin, slender-like villi, and we want a very short crypt. What happens when we wean that little piglet, we reduce dramatically the villus height, but we increase dramatically the depth of the villi. And it is the ratio between the one and the other that is very, very important. And you see here, when that little piglet is suckling the sow, that ratio is about 2.7. Here, it's 1.5. So anything that we can do to minimize those changes are going to be very, very useful. And one of the ways that we can do it is making sure our piglets eat. Some very nice work from Professor John Plusky, University of Western Australia, showed that as those little piglets ate more, this is dry matter intake along here, villus height along here, as they ate more, the villus height grew. They became longer and thinner. And as a consequence of that, the weight gain of those little piglets increased. So anything that we can do to try and maintain villi function is going to be very, very important. And interestingly, one of the ways that we can do it is by wet feeding our piglets after weaning. And that's why we recommend wet feeding after weaning, because here again is the study. This is before weaning. You see the nice long slender villi and the small crypt. Look what happens after weaning. Villus height is dramatically reduced, crypt depth is increased. But when we wet feed those little piglets, we actually maintain the height of the villi. So one of the recommendations is that after weaning, you should actually provide wet feeding for those little piglets. Because I think it's not only wet feeding. Part of the problem is those little piglets become dehydrated. And if they become dehydrated, they don't eat. And when they don't eat, they don't grow. So any way of providing water to those little piglets, and you'll see in a moment, that's why wet feeding, even if it's only for a 4-day, 7-day period after weaning, works very, very effectively. So one of the ways to try and help that little piglet is to ensure we maintain the height of the villi after weaning. But here, there are different feeds on the market. You can buy a cheap feed, you can buy an expensive feed. Here's a feed based on milk proteins. Here's a feed based on barley, wheat, and soya. Look at the difference in the structure of those villi between those two diets. This is a cheaper feed. Of course it is. Is that the feed you're going to buy? No. Why not? I agree. When we do a cost analysis, okay, this feed is cheaper, but look what's happening to the structure of the gut of those little piglets. And the thing I always say is, it's not the cost of the feed that is important, it's the cost of feed per unit of performance. And if you do the costing, this feed will always be the cheapest feed on the farm. And remember, you're only feeding it for a very long period of time. But it is critical we feed good quality diets to those little piglets after weaning. The other thing that is very important is health or immune status. And we talked a little bit about this when we had the lactation workshop. We know that immunoglobulins do not cross the placenta. So those little piglets are dependent on getting immunity from colostrum, in particular IgA, IgG, and IgM. And it rises rapidly. And the immunoglobulins and colostrum in milk are able to maintain the immune status for about a 14-day period. But after that, they begin to decrease. And this is when we need the pig's own active immunity to start to function. And the unfortunate thing is, this takes time. The active immunity is not fully functional until about 28 to 35 days after weaning. And that's why I think by weaning at 28 days, you're giving that little piglet the best chance to make sure it has got a fully functional immunity and is ever able to overcome and compensate for any disease challenge on that little piglet. Because health status has a very big effect on performance. Very nice example showing this is immune activation. When we have low immune activation, it's equivalent to high health status. The immunity in that little piglet doesn't have to work to actually produce an effect. High means the immune system has to work very high because there's a big challenge on that animal. So there's a big difference in terms of feed intake, going from high health to low health, 10% difference in feed intake, a 19% difference in growth rate, and a 10% change in feed efficiency. So anything that we can do to enhance health and immunity on our little piglets is going to be very, very important. We can look at it another way. This is a very nice study looking at different levels of lysine in the diet of piglets and measuring protein gain. The green line represents pigs of high health status. The red line, poor health status. So as we increase the level of lysine in the diet, in terms of the high health status pigs, we actually increase more or less linearly the protein gain of those little piglets. In fact, if they had fed more lysine, we've had an even bigger response in protein gain. But when we have a poor health status, we actually see a linear increase, but the protein gain is dramatically reduced. So even at the same level of lysine, those little piglets cannot deposit the same amount of protein. But the other very interesting thing is they plateau out. So even though we're giving them more lysine in the diet, they cannot use it for protein gain. Why? Effectively, what we have done is we have reduced dramatically the genetic potential of those little piglets to deposit protein. Because of low feed intake and so on. So the big question is, which pigs do you have in your farms? Of course, you all have high health status pigs, don't you? You would never have poor health status. But it's a serious question, because health status dictates the type of nutrition you should give to your animals. Because when you have high health status pigs, these need a lysine content of 1.5% in the diet. But if they're not high health status, they only need 1.2. I think in the future, we will have a way of assessing health status on farm by a product in blood called haptoglobin. That, okay, it's a laboratory tool at the moment, but I think one day it could well be a tool that we can all have on farms. You take a blood sample, measure haptoglobin, where am I on the health status scale? Am I high or low? Then you make and feed the diet accordingly. So health status, again, is something that's very important. We mentioned acids. Acids are very important because we need, as our piglets do, to maintain a low pH in our gut. Problem is, when that little piglet is suckling the sow, it drinks a lot of milk, it drinks a lot of lactose, which is converted into lactic acid. So we have very high levels of lactic acid in the stomach of those little piglets. When we change from milk to a creep diet, we lose a lot of that potential. So that little piglet needs to start producing hydrochloric acid in the stomach, as we do. Problem is, it never had the need to do it before. So again, it is something it just can't switch on. It takes time. And therein lies the dilemma that we're in. Because the type of bacteria that grows in the gut of those little piglets is pH dependent. So if we want our beneficial bacteria, our lactobacilli, or bifidobacteria, they need a low pH. But if that little piglet doesn't secrete acid and the pH within the gut increases, what happens? The beneficial bacteria increase, the pathogenic bacteria take the opportunity to infect the gut because they grow at a high pH. So unless we take action, we don't want this to occur, we want this to occur. And that's why in virtually every creep-free pre-starter diet, we have acids, because what that does is that helps make sure we're operating at a low pH, and therefore the chances of that gut being colonized by pathogenic bacteria are dramatically reduced. Again, another change. But it's not only lactobacilli. I'm not going to go into detail. It's just to show you, this is the microbes within the gut before weaning and after weaning. Just look at the differences in the color coding. Very different after weaning compared to before weaning. So we're changing the whole microflora growth in that little piglet. But here's our problem. This is looking at the total cultival bacteria in feces samples from piglets weaned at 21 days and then looked at the period after weaning. So the top line is the total cultival bacteria. The next slide shows the lactobacilli, the beneficial bacteria, the ones we want to grow in the gut. What do we see? A big reduction. And it takes a week at least for those lactobacilli to achieve the same level as they had before weaning. But if the lactobacilli decrease, what happens? the pathogenic bacteria take the opportunity to colonize the gut. So what do we see? A big increase in the concentration of coliform bacteria in the gut of that little piglet. What do we then get? What happens if the gut is invaded by coliform bacteria? Good health, scarring. When do we see scarring appearing after weaning on our pigs? How many days? Exactly. And that's why it is very important that we have acid products in that diet to make sure that the lactobacilli are maintained at the same level after weaning as they were before weaning.
Have you got an opinion, Bill, on which acids are most beneficial? Like, I mean, there are lots of different ones. Like, is it
there are lots of. So I don't have opinion. Well, I don't have opinion, but no, it's a very difficult question because there are so many. And the thing is, what you want is to have an acid that actually is going to operate right along the whole small intestine, not one that operates in the top half and has then disappeared. So I think salts of formic acid work very, very well. Stephen, do you have a comment on that?
You're right, it's more than blend. In the source of the side, you have like most people know butyric acid for more than hang done, but then some of the more simple acids.
Yeah.
And then the mixture is, the free acids are probably better, but how you use them in terms of health and safety and corrosion mixture, so salts are
Yeah. So mix of acid is the answer. Okay, we need to take account of the environment. And you don't need a thermometer in the pen to tell you if those pigs are kept at the right temperature or not. That's what we want to see. All those pigs lying, just touching each other within the pen. That indicates ideal temperature in that house. What we don't want to see is this. Pigs piling on top of each other. And the reason here is because the heat lamp is too high. So what happens is, this little piglet gets cold, so what does he do? He jumps on top of the group. So the one that was on the top is now in the middle. The one that is in the middle is now in the bottom. He's suffocating. So what does he do? He comes out. So instead of being nice toasty warm, now he cools. And then so this group is continually changing. If you want to encourage your pigs to have scarring and diarrhea, that is what you do on your farm. Very simple way is have this happening on your farm. So we can try to summarize all of this. Failure to implement the appropriate nutrition, management and healthcare policies results in poor nutrient digestion and absorption, reduced health status, proliferation of pathogenic bacteria. We see low growth and feed efficiency. We see an increase of scarring and diarrhea, poor subsequent performance and increased overall cost. And the reason for going through that is just to show you what is happening and then to say, okay, we know what is happening. Are there things that we can do? And Sean has already mentioned one of the things we put in diets is acidification products to make sure those little piglets have the right pH and we don't get the pathogenic bacteria growing. I want to talk very briefly about feeding in diets because pigs have different needs. This little piglet has different need from this piglet, different need from this piglet. And so we must change the diet specification depending upon the age at which those little piglets are, the body weight of those piglets. Then we can have a range of diets, pre-starter, starter, weaner, I think you call it link 1, link 2. So we have this table where we can work out exactly which diet you need on your farm for any weight and growth of piglet on your farm. But it's the quality of the diet that is very, very important. And this is a very nice example showing the quality of the diet and the post-weaning growth. So here we have a very simple diet, a barley, wheat, soya diet. And what you see is the big reduction in the weight of those little piglets after weaning. And in fact, it takes them about 7 days post-weaning to achieve the same weight they were at weaning. If we go a slightly more sophisticated diet, we reduce that lag time. And then if we feed what's called a complex, high-quality diet, we actually reduce that time at which those animals don't grow, instead from 2 to 3 days. So it's the quality of that diet that is very, very important for those little piglets after weaning. And again, this is some work that's presented by Paul Topless showing when we have complex feed compared to a simple feed, you see the proportion of piglets eating is dramatically increased. So palatability, the nutrients, the type of ingredients all have a very, very big impact to ensure that when we have a complex quality diet, all of the piglets in the pen will eat and hopefully will eat sufficiently. Again, I'm not going to go into dietary specification because these range of diets are available to you from Kiernan, so again, we don't have to go into detail. But it's quality diets that we are interested in. And by quality, what do I mean? I mean the ingredients, processed cereals and byproducts, milk byproducts, high quality proteins, fish, hydrolyzed soya, synthetic amino acids, sugar, oils, etc. The range isn't great, but the range, it's the quality of those diet ingredients that are very, very important. And a typical example might be cooked cereals, food fast soya, fish meal, milk products, high-grade fats and oil, animal products, animal proteins we don't have here. We can use yeast products instead, synthetic amino acids. So these diets are available to you. The big thing is it's the quality of that diet that is going to have the biggest impact on those little piglets after weaning. So why do I say quality diets? Well, very simply, because they will stimulate feed intake. They protect against disease. They make sure that the architecture of the gut is maintained. We don't see this big reduction in villi structure. And of course, if we don't have this big reduction in the height of the villi and capacity of the villi, then we're going to make sure we have the best digestion possible of nutrients from that diet. There's many other things, which I won't go into detail because there's a whole range of additives we can use, prebiotics, probiotics, acids we've already commented on, enzymes we've commented on. One of the things I want to say, a couple of comments later on is about zinc oxide, because as you know, the European Union wants to ban this high level of zinc oxide in piglet diets. We know zinc oxide works very effectively against scarring. And then they tell us to reduce antimicrobial use. So the question is, what do we do? But I want to look at it from the reason as to why the European Union want to ban it, because they say the amount of zinc that's being excreted by these piglets is having a very harmful effect on the environment. We'll have a look at that a little bit later. There are other technologies. We try and keep low protein. We try to keep protein as low as possible, yet maintaining amino acid, controlled feeding, liquid feeding, fermented feeding, and then an antioxidant status, because one of the things that happens, the oxidative capacity of those little piglets is reduced because of stress. And we need to try and imbalance that, which we can do through minerals, vitamins, and other things. So there's a number of strategies we can do. And here's just an example of when we take quality ingredients. This is an example of a yeast product that we can have in piglet diets. From a number of studies, we see growth rate improved by over 4%, feed efficiency improved by over 3%. And it's just giving you an example that when we use a quality product, how we can improve performance of those little piglets after weaning. So we can summarize. We need highly digestible energy and protein. We avoid soya because of anti-nutritional properties. We can use immunoglobulins. We can use immunomodifiers. We talked about actogen in soy diets. The same is true for piglets. Acidification products we've actually talked about. We can use enzymes, other things that we can add in that diet to try and enhance those little piglets, like flavors, sweeteners, liquid feeding we talked about. And then one of the things that is very, very important, we need to make sure our little piglets are drinking enough water. Because the big problem is, as I mentioned earlier, dehydration. So we want feeds that promote health, not harm. A few comments on feed presentation and feed quality. There are many ways to feed a piglet. We can feed it dry, which can be either meal or pellets. We can feed it liquid, which could just be in the immediate period after weaning. we call it gruel feed. We can then feed them a normal wet feed or fermented feed. And then we have what we call choice or menu feeding. And that is the piglet knows what it wants. So if we give it a series of diets, the pig will select enough of each to know what it wants. Problem is, at least my interpretation is the pig choosing by choice, or is the pig choosing by chance? A number of years ago, we did a study. We gave the pig 3 diets, and guess what? It selected the diets in the direct proportion that we wanted it to, so that it grew optimally. We said, this is brilliant. We have a way of making sure that over a period of 4 to 5 weeks, we just put three diets in the pen, and the pig will feed itself. We repeated the study. Guess what? The pigs choose exactly the opposite selection of feeds. And that's why I say, are they choosing by choice, or are they choosing by chance?
You never repeat a good trial.
As Dr. Brody said, once you get a good result, never repeat it. But okay, there is some interest in this, and I'm not sure how widespread it is. But I mean, we say that pellets is better than meal because we get better feed intake, we get less wastage, we get better growth rate, we get better feed efficiency. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, one of the ways that we try and help those little piglets is by wet feeding. And when we wet feed, this is feed intake, you see we get an improvement in feed intake, and this is the same feed but purely fed as a wet feed, and we get better growth rate. So one way to try and make sure we minimize that growth lag after weaning is through liquid feeding. And this is looking, we talked a lot about villi. This is just showing you why liquid feeding works so well. This is the typical dry feed. We talked about it. Days after weaning, when we move to dry feed, we see that the villus height is dramatically reduced, and it takes a 12 to 14 day period for that villus height to achieve the level it was pre-weaning. But when we feed a wet feed, we're maintaining the villi structure. And I think it's purely because we're giving water to those little piglets. So wet feeding is one way to try and make sure we're maintaining the whole function of the gut of the animals. A little bit about water and appetite. Little piglets need water. We know water is very important. If we have a first stage weaner, second stage weaner, in that first period, they need about 0.5 litres per day. In the second period, about 1 litre per day. We need to adjust the height of the nipples in the pen to make sure that we have the right height of nipple or drinker for the weight of those animals. And in that first stage, we say a water flow rate of 0.5 litres per minute, afterwards 1 litre per minute. A flow rate is very, very important because if those little piglets can't drink enough water in a certain period of time, they won't drink. They will only spend so much time drinking, and even though they may not be achieving what their intake should be. Some very nice work from Peter Brooks down at Sealhane in Plymouth, looking at different flow rates of water through the nipple drinker. Here, the flow rate, the water intake of those little piglets is 0.78 litres per day. Here, it's 1.63. Look at feed intake, it's 10% higher. Look at growth rate, it's 10% higher at the same feed efficiency. What is interesting, they measured how much time those piglets would spend drinking per day. Here, they consume 1.63 litres in 2.3 minutes. Here, they took 4.5 minutes to drink 0.8 litres. These little piglets here would have had to spend 10 minutes drinking per day to achieve this water intake, and they simply won't do it. That's why it is very, very important if you have nipple drinkers that you actually have a flow rate in that first stage 0.5, in the second stage 1 litre per minute. And of course, we all know, we've seen many, many studies showing the importance of providing additional water. This is with turkey drinkers, 2 studies, one by Simon Tibble, the other by John Gadd. And this is all it is doing is putting a turkey drinker into the pen of those pigs. Nothing else changes. What they found was feed intake, 10% higher, growth rate, 10% higher, feed efficiency, the same in the first trial. In the second trial, about a 7% difference in feed intake and growth rate and feed efficiency. So one very simple way to try and get those little piglets to eat is to put water in the pen. Because I say it again, the problem post-weaning is those piglets are dehydrated. Remember, they didn't have to drink very much because how much mother's milk did they drink? So they were getting their water supply, but now, where do they get it from? That's why it is very, very important. And again, the villi we've shown you, it helps to maintain villi structure. So some tips for watering weaners. Okay, we need 1 drinker for every 10 piglets. We make sure the system is cleaned out before those piglets arrived. We check that all drinkers are working, and we check and clean in that first week after weaning each drinker. We make sure that there's easy access to those drinkers. We've already talked about flow rate, 0.5 to 1 litre per minute. Test the quality of the water. Get a little bottle, put it underneath, fill it up, and take a drink. If you like the water, the piglets will like the water. If you don't like the water, the piglets are not going to drink it. But it's not something I suggest you do, because we have a good idea what's in there. Check salt levels, because too high a salt level in that diet will actually reduce intake. We talked about floor drinkers. Act against dehydration. How do you know if a piglet is dehydrated? How do you know if a piglet is dehydrated? It's very simple. Pinch the skin behind the ear. Remember, skin, the fluidity of the skin depends on its water content. And our bodies, like the little piglet's body, contain 65 to 68% water. So if that little piglet's dehydrated, that means there's less water under the skin, so when you pinch it, it stays up and doesn't go down. So a very simple way to check if those little piglets, if you're worried that they're not drinking enough, is just pinch their skin. And if it stays up, those piglets are not drinking enough. If it's like mine, because I had a drink last night, it's normal. But don't tell the wife if you're going out, just in case she checks that you've been drinking the night before. Monitor water consumption. And the thing is, check that piglets don't, some pigs you see after weaning become very pot-bellied. You ever seen that? Why is that? Because they don't eat and they drink instead. So what they're doing is they're filling their guts up with water to give them some form of satiation and not drink. So one way is that if they are pot-bellied, they're probably not drinking enough. And the consequence of that is we actually change the whole electrolytic balance in the body of that animal, and that in itself can cause a lot of problems. A very simple way to check for dehydration, pinch the skin. And there's our turkey drinker. Appetite. We talked a lot about appetite in terms of it's a big problem after weaning. So how much does our little piglets need to eat? We can calculate. Okay, what age are you weaning at? 26 days, 28 days? What weight are your piglets at weaning? 8 kilos? About 8 kilos? Okay, let's use 8 kilos. Okay, 8 kilos. Remember we said we wanted a growth rate of at least 250 grams. That little piglet has to consume over 300 grams of feed in that first week just to maintain that growth rate of 200 to 250 grams per day. The problem is all pigs will not eat that amount. And we showed you this earlier, the big reduction in feed intake after weaning and the time it takes to actually ensure the same level of energy intake after weaning as before weaning. So what kind of things can we do? Quality of the diet is very, very important. Feeder hygiene is very important. And remove feed not eaten each day for the first week. You can always feed it to other pigs, but feeder hygiene is very, very important, because the chances are that if you have stale feed there, you add more feed to it, you're going to end up with a potential mycotoxin problem. And that's what you don't want. We feed those little animals. We talked about the quality of the ingredients. Pellets are better than meal. We either feed pellets or we feed meal. What we don't do is feed a very bad pellet, which is a mixture of pellets and fines, because that will dramatically reduce the feed intake of those little piglets. So pellets is the way to feed unless you're wet feeding. And we can make the feed, let's say, more appealing. We can put things like sugars to try, and we can put appetizers in to try and improve the smell, the taste, the texture of that feed. Anything to encourage that little piglet to the trough is going to be very, very beneficial. How we place those feeders and drinkers is very important. We tempt the little piglets. Now remember, some of those piglets may not have eaten solid feed before. Although it was available to them while suckling the sow, they didn't eat it. So we have to try and somehow encourage them and tempt them. And one of the ways to do it is put a little tray on the floor with some dry feed in it to try and entice them and encourage them to eat. We've already talked about liquid feeding, gruel feeding, acidification of water, we've talked about, provision of water, the height of the nipple drinkers, the flow rate of that nipple drinker, and turkey drinkers. All of these things can make a big difference. Health status, as we've already seen, can have a big impact. Climate we'll talk about in a moment, because that obviously has a big impact. Do not overstock our pigs. Up to 20 kilograms, piglets need a minimum of 0.2 meters squared per pig, minimum. And if we don't give them that amount, what happens? How does the pig react? It reduces its feed intake. So if we don't give those little piglets enough space, they eat less. So you control how much space your piglets have and how many piglets you have in the pen. And the other thing is, keep the lights on for the first 2 to 3 days. What normally happens? You put the piglets in the pen. Oh, I want to keep them nice and quiet. What do? Turn the lights off. Now remember, piglet's just been come into the pen. Oh, where do I get food? Mother isn't here. Where do I get a drink? Mother isn't here. Where do I urinate? Where do I defecate? Keep the lights on. May cause a little bit more aggression, but at the end of the day, the benefits are in higher feed intake and higher growth rate. And we'll show you that data in a moment. And we talked about using enzymes. This is just one example to show that when we have enzymes in those feeds, how we can improve growth rate and feed efficiency in those animals. So there are techniques, there are products, there are things that we can put in the diet, how we manage that diet, how we manage those pigs, that are going to ensure that we're optimizing their feed intake after weaning. And the amount of space, the amount of trough space, feeder space we give those little piglets after weaning is also very important. Now remember, when they're with mum, they all ate together. After weaning, they still want to eat together because they think the amount of feed is limited and they all have to eat together. And through time, they then learn, feed is available throughout the 24-hour period. But in that initial few days, it's very important that we give every pig the opportunity to eat when they want to eat together. So we need extra trough space for that first few days until the piglets learn that feed is available throughout the 24-hour period. So we need to make sure we have sufficient trough space. Feeder design is very important. Is that what you want to see on your farm? Yeah? It's a good feeder. It's working well. Feed is being released in there. Problem here is feed and water is coming together. The other thing is, you can see on the other side, this feeder is across 2 pens. So you have reduced dramatically the feeding space to those piglets. But that is not what you want, because you will end up with a big problem. Stale feed, dirty feed, molds, mycotoxins possibility. So it's very important we don't have things like that. This is also what we don't want to see. And these are piglets that are weaned 3 to 4 weeks. What they're doing is they're all going around, they all want to eat. Why do they all want to eat? Now remember, they've been weaned, so it's not a question of thinking there's food available only so many times a day. This feeder ran out of feed. So when feed is put into it, all those pigs want to eat, and space is limited, so they can't do it. It's the same with water. We need to make sure there's always plenty, full supply of water available to those pigs so that they can drink at any one time. So, what should the correct filling of that feeder be? You tell me. That one, or that one? This one? This one? This one? That's what we want. Yeah. Just covering the floor of the trough with feed, and then, okay, when that's eaten, we can add more. So, and this is a very nice example. This is a big farm in Australia. And along here, the feeders running the whole length of the wall. You can't see them very well, but there's feeders there, with the result that every pig can eat whenever it wants to. Even if they all want to eat together, it can be done.
Is that sand around, buddy?
Sorry?
Is that sand or what?
This is chopped rice straw, available in Ireland, of course. Was enough rain anyway. But okay, so they have feeding facilities so that every pig can eat whenever it wants to. And that's very important in that period after weaning. Health. Poor health gives poor performance, and again, that's something we discussed at the lactation workshop, and I showed you this diagram before. But here is a very nice idea of just what is the impact of poor health. And here we have the same feed, the same pigs. One kept in a research unit, the other kept in a commercial unit. The difference in growth rate between the commercial unit and the research and development unit is 141 grams per day. Scarring dramatically reduced, mortality dramatically reduced. And the only difference is, as I say, commercial compared to a research environment. That means poor management, poor environment, and so on. So it's just an indication of the impact that poor health can have on our animals. And I showed you this before because we need to be able to know something about the health status of our animals. Because the big question is, if we don't, how do we know we're feeding them properly? Because the worst thing you can do is give a poor health status pig a diet for a high health status pig. You make it worse. And similarly, giving a high health status pig a lower specification diet for a poor health status pig, it will not grow to its potential. And health status has two big effects. One is it actually affects feed intake. The other thing is it affects the whole structure and function of the gut. And as a consequence of that, nutrient absorption is reduced and feed efficiency is become dramatically increased. So that's how health status affects our piglets. And again, I've shown you this, but this is just an indication of the number of additives or materials that we can add to try and benefit the health status of those little piglets. And again, when we talked about the sow, we talked about Actigen or biomass. This is just 3 different studies done on putting biomass or Actigen in piglet diets. And you see from all of these studies, we see a big improvement in feed intake, we see a big improvement in growth rate, and we see better feed efficiency. So we have products out there that can really help to maintain good health status in our piglets. I promised you zinc oxide. This is why we put zinc oxide in piglet diets. And generally we put about 3 kilos, providing about 2,400 ppm. And this is a review by David Birch, who's a well-known veterinarian in the UK. And what it tells us is looking at the improvement in growth rate. And we see when we go to these high levels, how we increase dramatically the growth rate of those little piglets, because it gives better health status to our piglets. We're not actually quite sure how it works in the gut of the pig. We think it could be working as a bacteriostat. But the European Union are not trying to reduce the level because of growth rate. They're trying to reduce the level because of the amount of zinc that's being excreted into the environment. I hope I've got my calculations right. But here's, okay, so here are piglets 8 to 28 kilograms, consuming about 25 kilograms of feed, and we feed them a diet with 2,500 milligrams of zinc. They consume 16.1 grams. Okay, we have ways of calculating how much of that is retained in the body of the animal. 0.3 grams are retained in the body of the animal, meaning that 15.8 grams are excreted in that piglet. If we can reduce it by 250 grams, okay, there's our intake, retention is the same. We have reduced excretion down to 3.4 grams. Okay, here's the grower finisher, 28 to 100 kilos at 80 milligrams of zinc. The amount of excretion is 21.4. So if we have a system where we've got a wean grower finisher with the high level of zinc oxide only for a 2-week period for that young piglet, it's excreting 37.2 grams, but when we reduce it down to 250, we reduce the excretion by about 12.4 grams. So we have reduced the excretion of zinc by about 33%. That's why it is being done. But I'm not sure if they've actually told us what level they would like to have in those diets. But it's being reduced because not of the effect on the piglet, it's because of the environmental effect associated with high levels of zinc and effluent and then fed to sheep and other animals. So it will have an effect. But if we are to reduce antimicrobials, then it's going to be a difficult situation over the next few years, because zinc can really help in diets where we're trying to withdraw antimicrobials in those diets. The final little area is about housing and the environment. Okay, and it's not just temperature. There's so many other things that influence, like other climatic variables, like wind speed, ventilation, stocking density, group size, air quality, feed management. And we know for many years what the requirements are. For week 1, this is 21-day piglet at weaning, needs about 28 degrees, week 2, 27, and then generally we reduce it by 1 to 2 degrees per week until we get down to about 20, 22 degrees. Those are specific conditions when we have low rates of air movement and relative humidity. And if those increase, then we need to change the temperature requirements. In fact, it's the combination of all of these that are important. But you can tell me, oh, I'm keeping my pigs at 28 degrees. The big question is, what's the variation? Do you have a very low variation or a high variation? Some very nice work by Jean Ledivitz at the INRA French Institute in Rennes had a mean temperature of 28 degrees over the 24-hour period, varying between 27 and 29. He had a mean temperature of 28 degrees, varying between 24 and 32. The greater the degree of variation, the bigger the effect on feed intake. The bigger the variation, the lower will be the feed intake, the lower the growth rate, and feed efficiency stays more or less the same. The other thing is, by having big variation, you will encourage scarring and diarrhea in those piglets. It's not just a question of growth rate, it's a question of health and immunity and scarring and so on. We need to take account of air movement. Generally, we should have still air conditions in the house. And this is a very nice study. It's a study called operant conditioning, where pigs are given the choice to choose their environment. done in the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. So they give pigs very low rate of air movement, 8 centimeters per second. The pigs choose an environment of, let's say, 18 degrees. They increase the air movement to 25 centimeters per second. The pigs choose a higher temperature of 20.5. They increase the air movement to 40 centimeters per second. They selected a temperature of 22 degrees. So high air movement, if we don't change the temperature, has the effect of chilling those piglets. And that's what I mean. It's not just temperature on its own. It's temperature, it's air movement, it's ventilation, all of those things. And as I said earlier, we don't need a thermometer to tell us if our pigs are kept at the right environment. If pigs are too cold, what do? Oh, they say I'm too cold, do they? Well, we know they huddle, they all come together, because effectively what they're trying to do is reduce their surface area, which then means less surface area for dissipating heat. And there's a number of things that you can do where, okay, we're not going to go into detail. You've got a copy of the handout. There's a number of things you can try. On the other hand, if pigs are too hot, what do? They try and spread out, they pant, they will wet their skin, they will wallow in feces and urine, and so on. And again, there's a number of things that we can do. We don't have time to go through every one in detail, but okay, it's in the list in front of you. But the amount of space we give those pigs has a very big impact. Remember we said earlier, a pig up to 20 kilograms needs 0.2 meter squared minimum. This is just showing that as we increase the amount of floor space we give those pigs, how we increase the amount of feed they consume and their growth rate. And one of the problems is you put 20 pigs in a pen at 8 kilograms and up to 15 or 20 kilograms, they have enough space, but you still have those 20 pigs in that pen until they're 30 kilograms. And then you say, oh, why are they not growing? The reason they're not growing is there's too little space, feed intake is reduced, and they don't grow. Is there an optimum number of pigs for a pen? How many pigs should we keep in a pen to optimize performance?
Depends on the size.
Let's say, okay, you can have different sizes of pens. It's the best to have a group size of 10, 20, 30, 40. Let's say they've all got the same space. Is there an ideal group size for pigs? There is 1 pig per pen. Is it economically viable? No. Okay, I must say I don't like to see these big groups where we get 100, 200 pigs in the pen. I think for me 20, as shown here, once we go to 20, 30 pigs per pen, then we see we can maintain good levels of performance. You go to some of these countries and you see 600 pigs in a pen. How do you know there's a problem if the pig is dead? You don't. It's very difficult. We need to have pen sizes, group sizes, where we can see every individual pig every day. Light. Keep the lights on. And this is why I make that recommendation. This is some, again, very nice work from Dutch study where they looked at the influence of 2 lighting regimes, 8 hours darkness, 16 hours light, and then 23 hours, 1 hour darkness, 23 hours light. Look at the difference in feed intake and growth rate. If those piglets are in the dark, how do they know where the spatial arrangement within that pen? They can't. Okay, and that's why I think it's something we should consider. So, okay, we need to talk about drafts. Air quality is very important. Okay, we don't have time to talk about it. Humidity, we talked about 24-hour temperature fluctuations and light intensity. These are all the things that are going to make a difference. We know these pigs are lying comfortably. We see different systems of production. Do you remember this? Remember the Nürtingen system? Probably not old enough. This is a system developed in Germany. No environmental control. All you had was a little box with plastic strips, and the idea was that the piglets would lie in there, stick their head out the plastic strips, get fresh air, and it worked exceptionally well. Only some pigs misuse it because this guy's lying with his arse out the window. So you can't teach every pig. It's like teaching new dog, old dog, new tricks and whatnot. Okay, and these are the kind of systems they have, for example, in Australia. And of course, we know what to do if a pig is too hot. Very simple. So my take-home message, just as my take-home message was for the other ones, the most important factor in weaner production is management. It's up to you. And are you ready for the challenge? And again, just as we finished, what are the pigs telling you? Look, think, act. Same message every time. Look, think, and act.